I think it was just last week that a movie called The Witness came out at the Independent Film Center. And maybe you've heard on the radio or read something about it. It is a documentary that was put together by the brother of Kitty Genovese. And if you don't remember the name Kitty Genovese, she is a woman who in 1962 was stabbed to death right outside of her own apartment building. And for half a century, the story that the general public had understood to be the truth, because it was in all of the press at the time, was that there were 38 people in that same apartment building who over the course of a half hour heard this woman being killed and did nothing about it. And this story became completely connected in the second half of the 20th century with the idea of cities being places of indifference and violence and cruelty and apathy. And absolutely went along with the understanding of urban decay that came down in the 70s and 80s and all this stuff, and how people in the city are somehow less concerned about one another than people in other places in the country. And I will tell you the truth that sometimes when people come to church, because Grace Church is a place where people come from all over the place, and they arrive at the church to begin with, and I'm meeting them, they come, really, they don't know it usually, that they have the story of Kitty Genovese in their head, but they really do, because they come to the city understanding, well, cities are a place where, you know, people don't really care about as much each other as people in little towns do, because they don't know each other as well, and I'm really on my own. And so they come rattled if they come from small towns in any other place when they are at the big bad city. And I think that that's really an archetypal story that largely has to do with this story from 1962 and Kitty Genovese. And as much as that is kind of an archetypal New York City story, imagine what that story was for this man, Kitty Genovese's brother, who was, I believe, 14 at the time of his sister's murder. And this man, over the course of 3 years, I think the last 3 years, pretty much at the 50th anniversary of his sister's murder, decided what he was going to do was he was going to peel back the layers of wallpaper on this iconic story about his sister and see if he could get closer to what really happened by having an opportunity to meet with people who were still alive, who reported on the story, and meet with people perhaps even who lived in the neighborhood to get a sense of what really happened that night. But he, 50 years ago, got the same story that everybody else got in the newspaper. And that story completely shaped this man's life because he adored his sister. And so he, when he was 15, swallowed that story whole. And it gave him the sense that there are lots and lots of people in the world, and certainly people who he associated with his sister's death, who were apathetic and didn't care about anybody else and wouldn't stick their neck out for the common good because all they were concerned about were themselves. And he decided that he wanted to live a life that was the exact opposite of that. And in his young mind, he decided that what he was going to do, the best thing he could possibly do to be a person who was concerned about the greater good and willing to stick his neck out for others, was as soon as he turned 18 to go into the Vietnam War and to sign up for the military, which he did. And at age 19, he lost both of his legs, and he came home. And so this is basically the formative narrative of this man's life. And the movie, the documentary, picks up with him as a man in his late 60s, going and trying to find out more about his sister's last half hour. And as he does this investigation, he uncovers something startling, which is the story as it was reported 50 years ago was a lie. That actually, Kitty Genovese died in the arms of a friend of hers. And the family never knew that. Not only that, people did call the police. And so this whole narrative about the 38 people who were completely indifferent that shaped this man's life turned out to be the wrong story. And one of the conversations that this man gets to have is with the son of Winston Moseley, his sister's murderer. Winston Moseley refused to have an interview, but the son of Winston Moseley agreed to meet. And these two men are roughly the same age. And this is the pivotal story. The story of Kitty Genovese's murder is the pivotal story that shapes the narrative of the rest of these men's lives for 50 years. And they meet in a room, and Winston Moseley's son became a minister. So here you have a man who was crippled spiritually and physically in response to his sister's. Another man, the son of the murderer, who became a minister because the narrative of his life was that he wanted to go out and heal a broken world. And Winston Moseley's son looks into the eyes of Kitty Genovese's brother and says, "The forgiveness I'm asking you to give my father is not for him. It's for you, so that you can be made free." This story is so bound up in both the Galatians text and the gospel. When we meet up with St. Paul this morning, the story he's trying to relay to the community of faith of Galatia is the moment that he realized that the narrative of his life, the story that he had based the first half of his life on, turned out to be untrue. So here's Paul, then Saul's story that he based his life on for the first half. It went like this. The people of Israel, meaning Saul's people, have been chosen in the middle of a broken world that has sinned so completely and been so profane that it has fallen out of the hands of a loving God, beyond God's reach. We have messed up so much that God is no longer able to reach us. And so the people of Israel have been chosen to live holy and righteous lives that will be a light in a dark world, that reconciles the people that God has created back to their Creator. And Saul's job, probably from the moment he started to learn Hebrew so he could read the Torah, Saul understood his job to be the person who is responsible for living such a holy life that the broken, self-involved world where there's apathy and greed and all of that fallenness, where that world will be able to see how good it is to live in right relationship with God and turn from their ways. And he understands that this is his job, to live this righteous life. And pretty much the entire creation and his relationship with the Creator in part relies on his ability to be holy. That's who he understands himself to be. And so, because that is his story, what happens to Paul is that he winds up, every time he fails, every time he sins, every time he falls off the bike, he winds up hating himself. And every time he looks at a world filled with all of the apathy and greed and licentiousness and despair, all of that sin in the world, he looks at all the people who don't understand the holiness of God, and he loathes them too. So what happens is that in Paul's goodness, he gets farther and farther and farther away from a loving God. It's a trap. And what he's telling the church in Galatia is that he had no idea that that was what was happening. He couldn't see it. Paul was so good that he held the coat of the people who picked up stones and killed St. Stephen in Acts. That's how good he was, because he wanted to see the world conformed back to God. And anybody who was a sinner had to be corrected or stopped. There's this wonderful story I heard when I was in Jerusalem. I don't know where it comes from, but my old New Testament teacher told me that there is a story in Judaism that if every Jew would just keep the law, keep the commandments simultaneously for one day, that the Messiah would come. This is Paul's story. And what he's telling the church at Galatia is that Jesus came and knocked him off his horse and knocked him out of that story and gave him a new story. And Paul heard in that moment of epiphany from Jesus that the story that Saul thought was the narrative that shaped his life was not true about his relationship with God. And the message that Saul received was that God loved him before he learned Hebrew, before he was able to learn the 10 Commandments. Every time he fell apart, his entire life, God never loved Paul because of how good Paul was. God loved Paul because he made him and he was Paul. And that the humanity and the creation has never fallen beyond the grasp of a loving God. That God's love is in every living thing. And that what Paul needed more than anything else, before he could help a broken world, was to believe that he was loved, regardless of whether he succeeded in his life or whether he failed. That God loved him from the foundation of the world. And if Paul was able to accept that that was true of him, and accept that was true of you, then that love of God would come gushing out of him and be the water in this parched world where there is so little forgiveness. We have so much trouble even forgiving one another, let alone nation forgiving nation. But if Paul could start first by believing that he was forgiven before he even messed anything up, because he is so loved, if he could begin by accepting that as true, God's love would come gushing out of him. And that was the rest of Paul's life, dropping that old story and picking up this new story in Christ. And the same thing happens in the Gospel of Luke. We have two people, kind of like Kitty Gervais's brother and Wynton Mosley's son, two people who have been shaped by the same story. It's the woman who's only described as a sinner, and it's Simon the Pharisee. This is not Simon Peter. This is Simon the Pharisee. And the woman who is only described in this gospel narrative as a sinner and Simon the Pharisee have been shaped by the same narrative as they have grown up, and it is this. Forgiveness is about as available as tickets to Hamilton. Hard to get, have to put a lot of work into it, and the currency is your spiritual holiness and your acts of righteousness. And you better have a lot of them, because if you have ever sinned, you're going to need all of that righteousness to be worthy of this forgiveness that is in such short supply. Now here's the difference. The woman who is described as a sinner apparently has been following Jesus around and watching what he's doing. And she's been watching Jesus lavishing forgiveness and healing on people who have been disgraced and people who have completely blown it and messed up their lives. People who feel like they have fallen so short that it's impossible to believe that they could ever be forgiven. Because why would you forgive somebody who has done such horrible things? This woman has watched Jesus healing them and loving them and coming to their houses and eating dinner with them. And she's seen it, and she's had this epiphany. Because she's seen that Jesus is the Messiah, and her epiphany is this: forgiveness isn't a precious commodity because it's so hard to get. Forgiveness is coming gushing out of this man, and it's available to even me. It's available to me, even as much as I have messed up in my life. I can have this gift of forgiveness, and I can be forgiven and loved and healed. Which is why she comes in weeping. She is so grateful. She's weeping and washing his feet with her hair. But here we have Simon. And Simon was brought up on the same story. The first story about how scarce a commodity forgiveness is. And here's what Simon has done. Simon has worked all of his life to be careful not to sin, to always do the right thing. He has risked very little because he wanted to make sure that he was right. And in risking very little, he's also failed to love. And so he has kept himself out of the reach of God's grace, not because it's not available to him, but because he's unable to accept it. Because he's not going to be going to a heaven with this woman who's a sinner, because he's worked so hard his whole life to be good. And so here we have the same story where this woman is able to see in Jesus this geyser of forgiveness and to be set free. And Simon, as respected as he is, and as comfortable as he might be in his lifestyle and with his bank account, all of those things, the prestige and the comfort of his life, he's still a prisoner. And this woman has been set free because that old tape in her life has been thrown out. Which leaves me with this question that I've been pondering for the last week after seeing that movie, and I'm going to leave with you. What old tapes are running in your head that make you believe that God's love isn't enough to free you? What are those old tapes? that tell you that God's love isn't your freedom? And how can you get rid of them so you can embrace this new story and be made whole? Amen.